Welcome back to this Labor Day weekend edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. And if you're known in your community for your conservatism, odds are at some Labor Day weekend fete, you're going to be hit up with those, well, what do you think about the governor's red flag laws and common sense gun regulation and so... And so when we sort of subtitled this episode, Lawyers, Drugs, and Money, it seems like this is the theme that we're putting together here for you. Joining us now from one of the great research operations, the CATO Institute, Jonathan Blanks, research associate, author of a great piece you may have seen in the Washington Examiner called Guns and Opioids, Fear is Driving Our Policy. And Jonathan, first and foremost, welcome to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. And I find myself sometimes at loggerheads with conservatives who want to, do something about the opioid epidemic, get them off the streets, keep them out of the hands of the wrong people. And I point out to them, often not making them happy, that they sound an awful lot like the leftists who say the same thing about guns. And again, and maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like in both cases they're inanimate objects who harm no one unless you misuse them. We are allowing the government to again become dictatorial over us. Now, you guys did a wonderful piece on this. What was your feeling about the Vox Populi and what we're asking the government to do, and then what the government is willing to do for us?
So, the genesis of this idea is I co-authored this with my colleague Jeff Singer, and he came to me after I wrote a piece on guns, and he was just like, it seems that we have something in common, that people are reacting to drug overdoses the same way they react to guns, just as you were saying. Why don't we write a piece together to explain how these things go together? And it turns out because people are horrified and saddened when people die, whether it's through gun violence or through opioid overdose. And so the natural reaction is do something. And of course, everyone turns to the government, whether you're left or right. At the end of the day, when something happens, they're like, oh, we need the government to do it. And the government, basically, as it does with many things throughout, as anyone in business can tell you, anyone who has any sort of stake in this society is like the government's going to criminalize something. And so what they're going to do is they're going to ratchet up the penalties for something that's already illegal, like, say, illegal gun possession, or they're going to, throw the books, and that's how we get all these drug laws, right? Yeah. So the government says, all right, so we see that these opioid deaths are happening, and we're going to crack down on chronic pain doctors because they're the ones that are driving this, even though the data actually doesn't show that. Mm-hmm. What the data says basically is, of course there's always going to be some misuse with prescription drugs, but what's actually going on is not, the fact that a lot of people have had prescription drugs, that's not what they're overdosing on for the most part. It's not what's getting people addicted. And where I work on with policing and gun laws, it's the same thing. They're like, oh, well, this gun violence and these mass shootings, we've got to crack down on, assault rifles and all this stuff. And it turns out that that's actually not where most people die, how most people die in this country from gun deaths. So it's just a bunch of the people are going to the government saying, please do something, and the government has a one-way ratchet with the criminal law, and that's what they're going to look like.
Well, and there are policies that don't bring the results, and I think it was Nick Freitas on the floor of the Virginia House of Delegates pointed out that the politician will just come back for more policy when the first policies don't bring the results they've promised the voter in this. And I guess that's the part that is hardest to grasp. And maybe as we've trundled towards more and more pure democracy, this is predictable, that the human votes, the gun, the opioid does not. So therefore it's easy to vilify them. But beyond that, I get why people want to do something about it. But why is it seemingly so hard to come up with real things to do about it? We talk about background checks, for example, and the number of guns that are sold, the percentage of guns sold in the United States without a background check, generally family member to family, is so minuscule, and the number of mass shootings or any sort of shootings done that way is minuscule. So changing the background checks is not really going to change anything. Building bigger backgrounds, which seems to be the subtext of the comprehensive background check laws, are, well, first we need to make a better background and leading to red flag laws. Many of these have already been tried in the opioid world, and to horrific results where people who are truly in pain don't get access to pain medication because they had a visit with a psychiatrist for a year or two when they were in high school or college, or sought help for some depression after a tragic life event, and that becomes a red flag. And now they're in chronic pain without being able to access the opioid. So we can almost prove how these policies don't work by combining these two issues. Is that a fair thing to say?
I think so. You have again, you can assume one of two things about the government. Either it's well-meaning and it's going to mess up, or that's just like, we're going to try and backdoor some law that we're trying to get further. Like, if you're a gun controller, you're like, oh, you can use mass shootings to try and get these laws passed that are going to bring more restrictions on guns, but actually aren't going to really affect gun deaths one way or another. Either way you look at that, that's just sort of how government tends to work, right? So the thing is like, they will try something and they'll criminalize it, and let's say it works, right? And they're like, okay, that works, so let's just double down on that. And then if they criminalize something and it's not going to work, and it doesn't work, like, oh, we didn't criminalize enough, so we're just going to ratchet up again. So the government just sort of has this one-way ratchet of what they're going to try and do. But yeah, I mean, the thing about background checks, particularly with firearms, most of the people who commit these heinous acts of mass shootings pass background checks. That most of those guns are legally owned. But the thing is, most gun deaths in this country, 2/3 are suicides. And again, most of those people pass the background checks.
Right.
And it's the idea that we're going to bring the government into the mental health space. I mean, I'm not saying that there can be no improvement to the background check system. Certainly there are people who get guns that shouldn't have them. But it's just so clumsy, and it's without some sort of due process safety net to try and make sure that people don't get on these red flag lists, and they can't get off, and they can't appeal it in any way. It's counterproductive. It's going to hurt more people than it helps.
Well, we've seen that, and I'm glad you brought up the mental health issue, because I think it is a common thread that runs in these two communities, the gun control and the opioid control worlds, is that these people need to get help. And in often cases, who determines that? And I've never seen an instance where that kind of scarlet lettering helps people, whether it be in school. If you think your admission to the college you want to go to is going to be damaged by you asking a guidance counselor for a referral to, just talk over some issue you're having, you're not going to do it, which just, is a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it?
I mean, there's always a chilling effect, right? That if you, the way that mental health is stigmatized in this country, if you start tying a bunch of laws and rights to it, that's just going to make it worse. And so, whether it's, what happens between you and your doctor should stay between you and your doctor. And I think that's just a core principle here. And that shouldn't have to, affect whether or not, you have a Second Amendment right to own a gun if you're not a felon, right? And that's the thing. And so the idea that your constitutional rights are going to be affected if you seek the help that you need at some point, that doesn't make you,
a felon.
It does make you a felon, and it doesn't tar you for life. I mean, people can have moments where they're like, I had, I was going through some stuff, and I sought some psychological help, and that shouldn't affect how you're treated for the rest of your life, regardless if we're talking in this gun space or anything else. But we have the stigma around it. It's like, and the mental health community is actually very upset about this. When the people who talk, when these mass shootings happen, the they're complaining is like most people who have mental illness aren't violent people. These are not people that are going to cause harm to themselves or others. They need help. But that doesn't mean that you need to be afraid of them. You need to stigmatize them in this way. And so it's this this cycle of let's find some group that is. I'm not saying this is a strategy, but this is generally what happens. Is like some group who's on the margins is going to be targeted, and it's like, oh, okay, well, we need to get these people to, we can't let them have guns, or we need to reduce how many drugs they can take, regardless of what the doctor in their lives says. And I don't think that putting that in front of the legislature is in any way a smart thing to do.
Now, your piece, and we're visiting for the next few minutes, Jonathan Blanks from the CATO Institute, co-author, as he said, and I apologize for not giving credit where credit's due, along with Jeff Singer on the commentary piece, Guns and Opioids, Fear is Driving Policy. One of the great hallmarks of Cato research and even the opinion pieces is the research and is the data point that you can use, as I said, when you come across this at the Labor Day barbecue or whatever it is you're attending to. But when you talk about opioid addiction, so many people say, well, it's an addiction to this. You have some great statistics in here that blow up the whole idea of the idea that it's addictive personality. It's 0.6% of patients prescribed opioids for acute pain, and roughly 1% of that on chronic opioid treatment are in the misuse rate. That's stunning for everyone who just thinks that opioids are this Woodstock Music and Arts Festival for people with addictive personalities, and those kind of statistics linked back at your article, I think are the reason that we really need to have a much better discussion as to what's going on here, rather than just vilify an inanimate object.
Right. So as we say in the piece, like a lot of people mistake dependency for addiction. You can become physically dependent on any sort of drugs like antidepressants, antiepileptics, beta blockers, and that sort of stuff. And if you just stop taking it, very bad things can happen. You can have withdrawal symptoms. You can even die. And so that's different than addiction, which has a very strong biological component, and that it's like that's that sort of really, when you think of, it's a terrible stereotype, but like when you think of the junkie, right? That's what addiction looks like, which is not the same thing as like, oh, well, my body's become dependent on opioids, and now my doctor cut me off, and my body needs this, and so you're going to go out and find it and try to get it, and that actually can lead to bad situations again, where again these side effects, excuse me, not in the medical term, but like the effects of these policies are prohibitionist policies, and they drive people to the black market. And once you leave like the controlled environment of medical pills, and you go to the black market, that's when you're getting into heroin and your fentanyl and that stuff. That stuff is cut with all sorts of things. It's mixed with all sorts of chemicals, and that's how people die. And the fact of the matter is, we don't have a sufficient regime in this country to actually handle opioid dependence in a practical and healthy way. It doesn't mean that that there is no way we can change policy to fix opioids. But the problem is we get these people in these bad situations and then cut them off and put them in the most desperate situations, which doesn't make any sense.
Well, it's the same thing that often happens is the fruit of a zero-tolerance policy, which is a government official's way of saying, I'm going to fix drugs in school, zero tolerance, and then some honor student gets kicked out of school for having Advil in their backpack, which happens, and it's not adjudicated because the zero-tolerance policy is written in stone, though they can't teach the Ten Commandments, which were also written in stone. But I digress, Jonathan. You bring up the best point, though. This is administrative. So we ban something. We say that somebody can't have this anymore. And instead of a doctor saying, hey, I think you've been on this too long, let's work on a system to backtrack you, they're required by policy just to say, that's it, you're done, have a nice day, don't let the door hit you on the way out, and leaving people no choice but the black market. The same thing with guns. If you're buying your gun out of the trunk of somebody's car in a back alley, Valley, you know you're already breaking the law, and you know you're already kind of circumventing society here. So there are things that that no law is going to change that unless we start working on the societal issues.
Right. One of the issues I deal with is policing, and particularly policing in the inner city. We got data showing that most of the people who are carrying guns and that commit gun crimes in the inner cities, they're illegal guns, like 9 to 1. They're almost all illegal, and they're carrying illegally because they're afraid for their lives. And the problem isn't so much that they are carrying guns. I mean, obviously it's not a good thing, but it's why are they carrying the guns? And the idea that you're going to fix that problem by just ramping up the penalties for that, if they really are scared for their lives, what's another year or two in prison if you get caught? It doesn't make any sense. It's really about trying to figure out what's going on. That neighborhood isn't safe, so how do we make that neighborhood safer so people don't feel they need to carry guns? Because there are 300 million guns in this country. We can regulate it around the margins all we want, but the fact of the matter is there are enough illegal guns in this country where that drive the street violence. So you're not fixing that, and the margins that we're talking about in this small number of people who are in the mass shootings, who are doing the mass shootings and whatnot, they would pass the background checks anyway. So we are putting up these laws and policies that aren't actually going to get at the heart of either problem. If there are more people who are doing mass shootings recently, we have to figure out why is that happening. We've had all these guns for all this time. What's the uptick now? What's driving that? But no one wants to think about that. They're thinking about, how do we ratchet up the criminal penalties act? How do we get more regulations on this? Instead of actually, what is the problem that we're actually facing and how do we best solve it?
Well, and that's the where I wanted to go with this. Who are we not talking to find these answers? Is it the law enforcement people, Jonathan? Is it the mental health professionals? Are they not given enough of a voice in this, and it's just policy wonks and people who try to come up with something that fits within a narrow guideline, or party officials? Who should the elected officials be referring to for their advice?
I mean, it depends on the situation. I mean, we treat all gun deaths the same, but the thing is, they're not. As I might have mentioned earlier, 2/3 of all American gun deaths are suicides. The rest are split up between sort of street violence, domestic abuse, accidents, and that sort of thing. And mass shootings make up a very small percentage every year. And so treating all of those things the same doesn't make sense because they all have different triggers, right? And so if you're talking about, how do we decrease domestic violence? How do you get involved in that? That's going to be a family counseling issue. How do we reduce suicides? Okay, that's a massive issue because people kill themselves for all sorts of different reasons, and so you have to figure out that's partially going to be mental health professional. That's going to be figuring out how to reduce those numbers. I have no idea personally, but the problem is these are all very complicated questions, and there are going to be a lot of different people you need to go to. Politicians want simple answers, and you're going to have activists that are like, here we are, we're focused on guns. What you need to do is change this gun policy right here. Or, hey, we're against the use of opioids, so we're going to try and get people to ban opioids. Right. The cops are going to be like, tell us where you want to go, where you want us to go, and they're going to go do it. And so that the public policy thing is we reward police officers on arrests they make and that sort of thing. Police officers individually don't get rewarded for reducing crime. They get rewarded for making arrests. So we actually don't even have the right incentive for something that simple. If the police are supposed to protect us, they're supposed to make our community safer, but we're not actually judging them on that. We're judging them on how many arrests they're making. Right. And so this is just sort of a broader problem with all public policy, particularly, and in the law enforcement community specifically, that we're just not asking the right people the right questions because it's too hard, and politicians, it's much easier to give me a simple answer and just give me one thing I can do, and that's what I'm going to do. All right,
and even if it's 1%, that is not an inconsiderable number of people in a country this size. Jonathan, real quick, and it seems tangential, but it's something that's been bugging me. It's like a mental earworm that I can't get rid of. It's like the opening of Blue Suede's song "Ooga Chaka Ooga." I just can't get it out of my head. The thought that there are 3 times as many Americans as there were 100 years ago, yet we, for the most part, have the exact same number of courtrooms and judges presiding over those courtrooms, maybe a few more. Maybe it's not a one-to-one. But it seems like if the whole role of our government as constituted is to defend our rights against somebody, violating them, wouldn't those courtrooms be the most important thing on a domestic policy agenda to fund and to keep open? And if there are more of us, we need more courtrooms to have our rights defended in?
Well, that's kind of a complicated question. So the question is are we arresting people? Are those courtrooms handling the right things right now?
Or are they overwhelmed? That's my feeling, is that our court system is overwhelmed. So people are just looking at zero tolerance things that will keep the courtrooms from getting overwhelmed.
Right, and so what we've done to do this, so again, because we arrest so many people a lot of times for not really particularly blameworthy conduct, and we drag them into court, we fine them, we do all sorts of things where we're clogging up the system with stuff that doesn't need to be there. And the idea that it's very easy for the government to throw someone in a cage is just the sort of assumption that we run with, that people should really start to think about. It should be very difficult for the government to decide to throw you in a cage, to deprive you of your freedom that way. Yeah. And the fact of the matter is we spend much more time in courtrooms dealing with misdemeanor dockets that don't necessarily need to be in the criminal law. Doesn't mean that they don't have to be done at all. You can have civil penalties. You can have all sorts of things. You can have cops on the street. Hey, can you move along? Don't do that today. All these different options for what we do with things we don't necessarily like. But because you incentivize police officers to make arrests, the courtrooms are clogged with a bunch of things that the courtrooms probably shouldn't be dealing with. Yet we have declining, even though we have declining violent crime, and we've had it trending downwards for over 20 years now, that our clearance rates for homicides and other serious crimes are actually going down as well. The number of people who are arresting for murder is going down in a lot of the major cities. So it's difficult. You're not solving the real crime that you need to be dealing with, but you're clogging our justice system with all these people who are making these ticky-tack offenses that we don't need to bring the entire bearance of the federal government or the local governments on these small offenses, but that's what's clogging up our system right now.
Interesting.
And so, yeah, absolutely. I think we need to refocus what we want the criminal justice system to do and who we're putting in there. And the fact of the matter is, right now, so long as the police think it's their job to put bodies in there, regardless of what they're in there for, we're spending money the entirely wrong way, and we're not making society safer.
And it seems like the communities are starting to push back against it, and to the peril of our law enforcement officers who are out there on the streets getting targeted as if they're targeting a particular community, and often left hanging to dry by the elected officials that have sent them out there in the first place. Jonathan, it's been a joy having you on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
And thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure.
You can read his column at cato.org, and it's titled Guns, Opioids, Fear is Driving the Policy. And for you all, thank you for joining us this week, Labor Day weekend. I hope you celebrate it by being industrious. Until next week, for all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, my name is Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish.